In the archives of the Chicago Historical Society, among thousands of photographs documenting the city's transformation during the early 20th century, sits a single image that has haunted researchers and visitors for over a century. The photograph, formerly catalogued as Child Subject Lincoln Park, October 1910, shows a small girl of perhaps 6 or 7 years old, sitting alone on a weathered wooden park bench beneath the spreading branches of an elm tree, whose leaves have begun their autumn transformation from green to gold. The child in the photograph appears to be dressed in her finest clothes, a white cotton dress with delicate lace trim around the collar and sleeves, dark stockings that have been carefully mended in several places, and small leather shoes that show signs of considerable wear, despite obvious attempts to keep them polished and presentable. Her dark hair has been arranged in neat braids, tied with ribbons that might once have been bright blue, but appear faded and slightly frayed in the sepia-toned image. What draws the viewer's attention immediately, however, is not the child's clothing or the peaceful park setting, but rather her expression. The little girl is smiling directly at the camera, but there is something deeply unsettling about that smile, a quality that seems to suggest she is trying very hard to appear happy despite circumstances that would give any child cause for distress. Her eyes, large and dark in her small face, do not share in the apparent joy of her smile, but instead hold a depth of sadness and uncertainty that seems far too mature for someone so young. The photograph was taken by Jacob Müller, a German immigrant who had established himself as one of Chicago's most respected documentary photographers during the first decade of the 20th century. Born in Bavaria in 1865, Müller had arrived in Chicago in 1889 with little more than his camera equipment and a burning desire to document the human experience in America's rapidly growing industrial cities. His early years in Chicago had been marked by struggle and poverty as he worked various manual labor jobs while slowly building his reputation as a photographer capable of capturing the authentic emotions and experiences of ordinary people. Müller's work typically focused on the social conditions and daily life of the city's rapidly growing population, with particular attention to the experiences of immigrant families and the working poor. His photographs were often commissioned by social reform organizations who used them to illustrate the need for better housing, education, and social services for Chicago's most vulnerable residents. Organizations like Hull House, the famous settlement house founded by Jane Addams, regularly employed Müller's services to document the conditions in which their clients lived and worked. By 1910, Müller had achieved considerable recognition for his documentary work, with his photographs appearing in national magazines and social reform publications throughout the United States. His technique was characterized by an ability to gain the trust of his subjects, allowing him to capture intimate moments that revealed the dignity and humanity of people whose lives were often overlooked by mainstream society. Unlike many photographers of his era who approached the poor and immigrant communities as exotic subjects to be studied from a distance, Müller understood their experiences from personal knowledge, having lived through many of the same struggles himself. However, this particular photograph stood apart from Müller's usual work in several significant ways. Unlike his typical documentary images, which were clearly intended to illustrate specific social conditions or problems, the photograph of the solitary child seemed to have been taken spontaneously, without the careful staging and deliberate messaging that characterized his commissioned work. The composition was simpler, more intimate, suggesting that Müller had encountered the child by chance and had been moved to document her presence in the park for reasons that were not immediately apparent. More puzzling was the fact that the photograph had never been published or used by any of the social reform organizations that typically employed Müller's services. Instead, it had remained in his private collection until his death in 1943, when his photographic archive had been donated to the Chicago Historical Society by his surviving family members. For decades, the image had been filed away among thousands of other photographs, noted only for its technical quality and its value as a representation of children's clothing and park design from the period. The circumstances under which the photograph came to the attention of researchers in 2024 were themselves remarkable. Dr. Sarah Kowalski, a social historian specializing in child welfare policies and practices at Northwestern University, had been awarded a substantial 3-year grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to study the experiences of homeless and abandoned children during the period of massive immigration and urbanization that had transformed American cities between 1900 and 1920. Dr. Kowalski herself brought a deeply personal perspective to this research, as her own great-grandmother had been an abandoned child during this same period, left at a Chicago orphanage in 1908 with no record of her family background or origins. The family stories that had been passed down through generations spoke of a little girl who had never spoken of her life before the orphanage and who had carried the psychological scars of abandonment throughout her long life, even after achieving success and happiness in her later years. This personal connection had motivated Dr. Kowalski to pursue academic work that might shed light on the experiences of children like her great-grandmother, hoping to understand both the individual trauma of abandonment and the broader social systems that had made such abandonment so common during the early 20th century. Her previous research had already revealed disturbing patterns in how society had dealt with children who found themselves without family support during this era. Official records showed that thousands of children had been abandoned each year in major cities like Chicago, often by parents who were unable to care for them due to poverty, illness, or other desperate circumstances. Many of these children had ended up in overcrowded orphanages or had been sent west on orphan trains to work as unpaid laborers on farms and ranches, while others had simply disappeared into the urban landscape, surviving through begging, petty theft, or worse. The orphan train system, which operated between 1854 and 1929, had transported an estimated 250,000 children from eastern cities to rural areas, ostensibly to provide them with better opportunities for healthy development away from urban poverty and corruption. However, Dr. Kowalski's research had revealed that many of these placements were essentially forms of child labor, with children expected to work long hours in fields or households with little or no education or opportunity for normal childhood development. The program had been promoted by its organizers as a humanitarian effort to save children from lives of poverty and potential criminality, but the reality for many participants had been harsh and exploitative. Children as young as 4 or 5 had been sent hundreds of miles from their birthplaces to live with strangers, who often viewed them primarily as sources of free labor rather than as young people deserving of care and nurturing. Dr. Kowalski had been using photographic evidence to supplement the often incomplete official records of these children's experiences, searching for images that might provide insights into their daily lives and the conditions they had faced. The Chicago Historical Society's extensive photographic collection had proven to be a treasure trove of such evidence, containing thousands of images that documented various aspects of urban life during the early 20th century. When she encountered Muller's photograph of the solitary child in Lincoln Park, something about the image struck her as significant, though she could not immediately articulate what had captured her attention. Perhaps it was the incongruity between the child's carefully maintained appearance and her obviously solitary situation. Few parents in 1910 would have allowed such a young child to sit alone in a public park, particularly not a child who was clearly dressed for some special occasion. Or perhaps it was the quality of the child's smile, which seemed to Dr. Kowalski to convey a desperate attempt to appear normal and happy despite circumstances that were anything but normal. Having studied thousands of photographs of children from this period, Dr. Kowalski had developed an eye for the subtle signs of distress that children often displayed even when trying to appear composed for the camera. The child's posture also struck her as unusual. While she sat upright on the bench with her hands folded in her lap, in a pose that suggested good breeding and careful instruction in proper behavior, there was something rigid about her positioning that suggested anxiety rather than natural composure. Her feet, which did not quite reach the ground from the adult-sized bench, were positioned precisely parallel to each other in a way that seemed more like following remembered instructions than natural comfort. Intrigued by these inconsistencies, Dr. Kowalski began to investigate the specific date and location of the photograph, hoping to find additional context that might explain the child's situation. Using weather records, newspaper archives, and other contemporary documents, she was able to establish that the photograph had been taken on October 15th, 1910, a Sunday afternoon when Lincoln Park would have been busy with families enjoying the mild autumn weather. Lincoln Park in 1910 was one of Chicago's most popular recreational areas, stretching for several miles along the shore of Lake Michigan and featuring extensive gardens, walking paths, and recreational facilities that attracted visitors from throughout the city and surrounding suburbs. On pleasant weekend afternoons, the park would typically be filled with families enjoying picnics, children playing games, couples strolling through the gardens, and various social groups holding organized activities. This context made the child's solitary presence even more puzzling. On a beautiful Sunday afternoon, when the park would have been filled with families and children playing together, why was this little girl sitting alone on a bench, dressed in her finest clothes, but with no adult supervision or companions visible anywhere in the frame? Dr. Kowalski's examination of the photograph using modern digital enhancement techniques revealed additional details that had not been apparent in the original print. The child's clothing, while clean and carefully arranged, showed subtle signs of having been worn for an extended period. Small wrinkles and creases that suggested she had been sitting in the same position for a considerable time. Her hands, folded in her lap, appeared to be gripping each other tightly, and there were what looked like tear stains on her cheeks that had been largely concealed by the sepia tone of the original photograph. Most significantly, enhanced examination of the child's eyes revealed a look of watchful anxiety that was inconsistent with the confident smile she was presenting to the camera. Her gaze seemed to be fixed not on the photographer himself, but on some point beyond him, as if she were constantly scanning the area for someone who was supposed to appear but had not yet arrived. Dr. Kowalski's search through Chicago newspaper archives from October 1910 eventually yielded a clue that would transform her understanding of the photograph entirely. Buried in the back pages of the Chicago Tribune's October 16, 1910 edition was a brief article with the headline, "Child Found Abandoned in Lincoln Park." The article, less than 2 inches long and positioned among advertisements for patent medicines and household goods, reported that a young girl had been discovered sitting alone on a park bench the previous afternoon, apparently having been left there by unknown persons. According to the newspaper report, the child had been found by Mrs. Helen Morrison, a well-dressed woman who had been walking through the park with her own family, when she noticed the little girl sitting in the same spot for what appeared to be several hours without any sign of adult supervision. Mrs. Morrison had initially assumed that the child's parents were nearby, perhaps visiting the restroom facilities or purchasing refreshments from one of the park vendors. However, as the afternoon progressed and the temperature began to drop with the approaching evening, Mrs. Morrison became concerned about the child's welfare. When she approached the little girl and asked where her parents were, the child had initially responded that her mother would be returning soon to collect her. The child seemed polite and well-spoken, giving no indication that she was in distress or that anything unusual was happening. But as Mrs. Morrison continued to observe the situation, she noticed that the child's confident assertions about her mother's imminent return seemed increasingly forced and desperate. When asked specific questions about where her mother had gone or when she was expected to return, the child's answers became vague and contradictory. Eventually, it became clear that the little girl had no real knowledge of when or if anyone would be coming for her. The article noted that the child appeared to be well cared for and was wearing clean, pressed clothing that suggested she came from a family of at least modest means. Her white dress was made of good quality cotton with hand-sewn lace trim that would have been expensive to purchase or time-consuming to create by hand. Her shoes, while showing wear, were of solid construction and had been recently polished. Even her hair ribbons, though faded, were made of silk rather than the cheaper cotton or wool substitutes that most working-class families would have used. However, despite her well-maintained appearance, the child carried no identification and claimed not to know her last name or address. When asked about her circumstances, she would only say that her mother had told her to wait on the bench and that someone would come for her soon. She seemed to have been carefully coached in what to say, but her instructions had apparently not included information about what to do if no one arrived to collect her. Mrs. Morrison had contacted the park police, who had in turn notified the Cook County Children's Services Department. The child had been taken to the Cook County Children's Home, where officials would attempt to locate her family or find suitable placement for her care. The article concluded with a request that anyone with information about the child's identity should contact the authorities, though Dr. Kowalski's subsequent research revealed that no one had ever come forward with such information. Dr. Kowalski realized that she had discovered the story behind Miller's photograph. The little girl sitting alone on the park bench had been captured at the very moment of her abandonment. Her forced smile an attempt to maintain hope and normalcy in a situation that was anything but normal. The photographer had unknowingly documented one of the most traumatic moments in a child's life, preserving forever the image of a little girl trying desperately to believe that her mother would return for her. This revelation prompted Dr. Kowalski to expand her research, searching for additional information about what had happened to the abandoned child after she was taken to the Cook County Children's Home. What she discovered was a bureaucratic system that was woefully inadequate to deal with the thousands of abandoned and orphaned children who passed through its care each year. The Cook County Children's Home, officially known as the Chicago Home for the Friendless, was a massive institution that housed over 800 children at any given time during the early 1910s. The facility had been established in 1883 as a temporary shelter for homeless children, but had gradually evolved into a long-term residential institution for children who could not be placed with families or who had been removed from unsuitable home situations. The physical plant of the children's home consisted of several large brick buildings arranged around a central courtyard, with separate dormitories for boys and girls, dining halls, classrooms, workshops, and administrative offices. The buildings were constructed in the institutional style typical of the late 19th century, with high ceilings, large windows, and minimal decoration or comfort features. The overall effect was imposing and somewhat prison-like, designed more for efficiency and crowd control than for creating a warm, home-like environment for children. The facility was chronically underfunded and understaffed, with children often receiving minimal education, inadequate medical care, and little individual attention from the overwhelmed staff. The institution operated on a strict schedule designed to manage large numbers of children with limited personnel, with wake-up at 5:30 a.m., meals served at precisely scheduled times, and lights out at 8 p.m. for all residents, regardless of age. Living conditions were harsh even by the standards of the time, with children sleeping in large dormitories containing dozens of iron beds arranged in military-style rows. Each child was assigned a small wooden box for personal belongings, though most abandoned children arrived with few or no possessions. Clothing was provided by the institution and consisted of simple, durable garments designed for utility rather than comfort or attractiveness. The daily routine included several hours of basic education, with children learning reading, writing, and arithmetic in large classrooms taught by overworked teachers who often had little training in child development or pedagogy. Older children were assigned to various work details that helped maintain the institution: cooking, cleaning, laundry, and basic maintenance tasks that provided practical training while reducing operational costs. Meals were simple and nutritious but monotonous, consisting primarily of bread, porridge, beans, and occasional vegetables from the institution's own garden. Meat was served infrequently, and special treats or individual food preferences were essentially unknown. Children were expected to eat what was provided without complaint and to be grateful for the basic sustenance they received. Medical care was provided by a single physician who visited the institution twice a week, supplemented by a small nursing staff that dealt with routine injuries and illnesses. Serious medical problems often went untreated due to lack of resources, and children with chronic conditions or disabilities received minimal specialized care. Mental health was not recognized as a legitimate medical concern, and children exhibiting signs of psychological trauma or distress were typically disciplined rather than treated. Records from the children's home showed that most abandoned children were processed quickly through the system, with officials making little effort to locate missing families or to carefully evaluate potential placements. The institution's philosophy emphasized moving children out of the facility as quickly as possible, both to reduce costs and to make room for the constant stream of new arrivals. Children who were not claimed by family members within a few weeks were typically sent to rural areas as unpaid laborers, placed with families who were more interested in free help than in providing loving homes for traumatized children. These placements were arranged through a network of agents who traveled throughout the Midwest, seeking families willing to take in children, often with minimal investigation into the character or motivations of potential guardians. The process of matching children with families was haphazard at best, with decisions often based more on the immediate availability of placements than on careful consideration of individual children's needs or compatibility with potential guardians. Children were typically given little or no information about their destinations, and once placed, there was minimal follow-up to ensure their welfare or adjustment. Dr. Kowalski's search for specific information about the child from the photograph proved challenging, as the home's record-keeping was haphazard and many documents from the period had been lost or destroyed over the intervening decades. However, she was eventually able to locate a partial intake record from October 1910 that listed a girl of approximately 7 years old who had been brought to the facility after being found abandoned in Lincoln Park. The record identified the child only as Mary Unknown, indicating that she had either been unable or unwilling to provide her real name to the intake staff. This was not uncommon among abandoned children, who sometimes refused to give their names out of loyalty to parents who had left them, or who had been instructed not to reveal family information for reasons they did not understand. Physical descriptions in the record matched the child in Miller's photograph: dark hair, brown eyes, small for her age, wearing a white dress with lace trim. The record also noted that the child had been cooperative but withdrawn during her initial interviews, and that she had insisted repeatedly that her mother would come for her soon. The intake process at the children's home was designed to be efficient rather than therapeutic, with new arrivals subjected to medical examinations, delousing treatments, and assignment to dormitories and work details within hours of their arrival. Children were expected to adapt quickly to institutional routines and to suppress any emotional reactions to their separation from familiar environments and people. Most heartbreaking was a notation that Mary had refused to remove or allow staff to wash the dress she had been wearing when found, claiming that her mother had told her to keep it clean for when she returned. The staff had eventually been forced to remove the dress while the child slept, leading to significant distress that had required intervention from the facility's medical staff to calm her down. This incident had been noted in Mary's file as evidence of difficult adjustment and possible behavioral problems, classifications that would have made her a less desirable candidate for placement with families seeking well-behaved, easily managed children. The institutional perspective viewed emotional attachment to personal belongings as a form of unhealthy sentimentality that needed to be eliminated for the child's own good. Subsequent entries in Mary's record documented a pattern of quiet resistance to institutional routines and persistent questions about when her mother would come to take her home. Staff notes described her as polite but uncooperative and emotionally immature for her age, terms that reflected the institution's inability to recognize or address the psychological impact of abandonment on young children. The final entry in Mary's record, dated November 3, 1910, indicated that she had been placed for adoption with the Morrison family of Cedar Rapids, Iowa. The timing suggested that Mary had spent approximately 3 weeks in the children's home before being sent to her new placement, a relatively short stay that indicated either that the Morrison family had specifically requested a young girl matching her description, or that officials had been eager to move her out of the facility due to her adjustment difficulties. No further details were provided about the Morrison family or the circumstances of the placement, and Dr. Kowalski's attempts to locate additional information about Mary's fate after leaving the children's home proved initially unsuccessful. However, her research did reveal disturbing information about the general practices surrounding such placements during this period. Children sent to rural families were often treated more as unpaid servants than as adopted family members, expected to work long hours in fields or households with little or no education or opportunity for normal childhood development. Many of these arrangements were essentially forms of child labor that were legal under the social service practices of the time, justified by arguments that hard work would build character and that rural environments were inherently healthier for children than urban settings. The Morrison family of Cedar Rapids proved to be typical of many families who received children through these placement programs. John Morrison was a farmer who owned a modest property outside the city, specializing in corn and livestock production that required substantial manual labor throughout the growing season. His wife, Martha, was responsible for maintaining a large household that included their own 3 children, as well as various relatives and hired hands who lived on the property during busy agricultural periods. The Morrisons had requested a girl of Mary's age specifically because they needed help with household chores and childcare responsibilities that were beyond the capacity of their own young children. Their application to receive a placed child had emphasized their desire to provide a good Christian home for an unfortunate child, but the practical considerations of securing additional household help had clearly been a primary motivation. Records from the Cedar Rapids area revealed that the Morrison family had received at least 3 other children through similar placement programs over the years, suggesting that taking in abandoned children had become a regular practice for them. However, there was no indication that any of these children had remained with the family into adulthood or had maintained contact with the Morrisons after reaching the age of majority. More troubling still was evidence that many children placed through these programs experienced abuse, neglect, or abandonment by their new families, often finding themselves in situations that were worse than the institutional care they had left behind. Children who ran away from abusive placements or who were returned by families who no longer wanted them often ended up back in the institutional system, but frequently with no record of their previous placements or the reasons for their return. Dr. Kowalski's investigation into Mary's specific experience with the Morrison family required extensive detective work, as official records from the period were incomplete and often contradictory. However, she was eventually able to locate several sources of information that provided insight into what had happened to Mary after her placement in Iowa. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a collection of letters donated to the Iowa State Historical Society by a descendant of the Morrison family. Among these papers was a brief correspondence between Martha Morrison and her sister in Illinois, written in early 1911, that mentioned difficulties with the girl from Chicago who had been placed with the family the previous autumn. According to Martha Morrison's letter, Mary had proven to be willful and uncooperative in her assigned household duties, frequently asking when she could return to Chicago to find her mother. The letter complained that Mary seemed unable to understand that her previous life was over, and that she needed to accept her new circumstances, describing her behavior as ungrateful given the Christian charity the family was showing her. More revealing was Martha's description of Mary's emotional state, which she characterized as melancholy and strange, noting that the child often seemed to be listening for something or someone who was not there. Mary had developed a habit of standing at the farmhouse windows for long periods, watching the road that led to town as if expecting someone to arrive at any moment. The letter also mentioned that Mary had been caught several times attempting to walk to town, apparently with the intention of finding transportation back to Chicago. These escape attempts had resulted in increasingly severe punishments, including confinement to her room and reduction of her already minimal personal privileges. Most disturbing was Martha Morrison's observation that Mary seemed to be fading away despite adequate food and shelter, becoming increasingly thin and listless as the months passed. The family had consulted their local physician, who had diagnosed Mary with nervous weakness and had recommended a regimen of hard work and strict discipline to cure her of what he considered to be unhealthy sentimentality about her past. The final letter in the collection, dated March 1911, indicated that the Morrison family had decided to return Mary to the authorities, claiming that she was unsuitable for farm life and that her presence was having a negative influence on their own children. The letter mentioned that arrangements had been made to send Mary back to Chicago, though it was unclear whether she would be returned to the children's home or placed elsewhere. Kowalski's attempts to trace Mary's path after her return from Iowa led her back to the records of the Cook County Children's Home, where she discovered that Mary had indeed been readmitted to the institution in April 1911. The second intake record was brief and clinical, noting only that Mary had been returned from failed placement and that she appeared to be suffering from failure to thrive syndrome. This second stay at the children's home appeared to have been much more difficult than Mary's first experience at the institution. The child, who had been described as cooperative but withdrawn during her initial placement, was now characterized as unresponsive and difficult to manage. Staff notes indicated that Mary rarely spoke, refused to participate in group activities, and showed little interest in food or personal hygiene. The institutional response to Mary's deteriorating condition was to increase the strictness of her treatment, based on the prevailing belief that children's behavioral problems were the result of insufficient discipline rather than psychological trauma. Mary was assigned to additional work duties and was subjected to isolation in a punishment dormitory when she failed to meet institutional expectations for behavior and compliance. Medical records from this period showed that Mary's physical health was also declining, with notes documenting significant weight loss, frequent illnesses, and what appeared to be symptoms of severe depression. However, the institutional physicians attributed these problems to willful self-neglect, rather than recognizing them as signs of serious psychological distress. The final entry in Mary's institutional record was dated September 15, 1911, and simply stated that she had died of consumption during the night. The brief notation provided no details about the circumstances of her death or any attempts that might have been made to provide medical treatment during her final illness. Mary had been buried in the institution's cemetery, a small plot of land adjacent to the children's home, where children who died in care were interred in unmarked graves. The burial record listed her only as Mary Unknown, age approximately 8 years, with no mention of her family background or the circumstances that had brought her to the institution. Dr. Kowalski's discovery of Mary's tragic fate prompted her to expand her research to examine the broader context of child mortality in institutional care during the early 20th century. What she found was a pattern of neglect and inadequate care that had resulted in death rates among institutionalized children that were significantly higher than those of children in the general population. Contemporary medical literature from the period revealed that physicians and social workers of the time had identified what they called failure to thrive syndrome among institutionalized children, but had generally attributed this condition to inherent weaknesses in the children themselves rather than to the institutional environments in which they were placed. Modern medical understanding recognizes that many of these children were suffering from what would now be diagnosed as severe depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and other psychological conditions resulting from abandonment trauma and institutional mistreatment. However, the medical and social service professionals of 1910 lacked the knowledge and tools necessary to recognize or treat these conditions effectively. The institutional philosophy of the time emphasized the need to break down children's emotional attachments to their previous lives in order to prepare them for successful placement in new families. This approach, while well-intentioned in theory, often resulted in systematic psychological abuse that destroyed children's sense of identity and self-worth. Mary's experience was tragically typical of thousands of children who passed through the child welfare systems of the early 20th century. Her death at age 8 represented not just an individual tragedy, but a systematic failure of social institutions to provide adequate care for society's most vulnerable members. Dr. Kowalski's research revealed that Mary's story was far from unique during this period. Mortality rates at the Cook County Children's Home and similar institutions throughout the United States were consistently higher than those of children in the general population, with deaths often attributed to diseases that were preventable with adequate nutrition and medical care. More disturbing still was evidence that many of these deaths were the direct result of institutional policies that prioritized cost control over child welfare. Overcrowding, inadequate nutrition, poor sanitation, and minimal medical care had created conditions that were conducive to the spread of infectious diseases and the deterioration of children's health. The psychological impact of institutional care was also devastating for many children, with contemporary observers noting high rates of what they termed melancholia and nervous disorders among institutionalized children. Many children who survived their institutional experiences carried psychological scars throughout their lives, struggling with depression, anxiety, and difficulty forming trusting relationships. Dr. Kowalski's investigation also revealed that the problem of child abandonment during the early 20th century had been much more widespread than previously recognized by historians. Economic pressures, social stigma surrounding unwed motherhood, mental illness, and simple desperation had led thousands of parents to abandon children they could no longer care for, often in public places where they hoped the children would be found quickly and cared for by others. The practice of abandoning children in parks, outside churches, or at the doorsteps of prosperous families was so common during this period that most major cities had developed specific protocols for dealing with found children. However, these systems were overwhelmed by the sheer number of cases, leading to rushed decisions and inadequate care that often resulted in additional trauma for children who had already experienced the devastating loss of their families. Perhaps most tragic was Dr. Kowalski's discovery that many of the parents who abandoned children during this period had done so believing they were acting in their children's best interests. Contemporary social service literature promoted the idea that children were better off in institutional care or adoptive families than with parents who could not provide adequate food, clothing, or shelter. This messaging had convinced many desperate parents that abandonment was an act of love rather than neglect, leading them to believe that their children would be better cared for by strangers than by their own families during times of crisis. The tragic irony was that many of these children would have been better off remaining with their struggling families than being subjected to the harsh conditions of institutional care. Mary's mother, whoever she was, had likely dressed her daughter in the finest clothes available and had probably spent considerable time preparing her for what she hoped would be a temporary separation. The careful attention to Mary's appearance in the photograph suggested a mother who had wanted her child to make the best possible impression on whoever found her, perhaps hoping that well-dressed, well-behaved children would be more likely to find good homes. The forced smile that had so disturbed Dr. Kowalski when she first saw the photograph now took on additional significance as evidence of careful coaching by a mother who had tried to prepare her daughter for abandonment by teaching her to appear happy and confident even when frightened and alone. The smile was not just an attempt by the child to cope with her situation, but a reflection of her mother's desperate hope that appearing cheerful would somehow protect her daughter from the worst consequences of what she was about to do. Dr. Kowalski's research also revealed that Jacob Müller, the photographer who had captured Mary's image, had likely understood the significance of what he was witnessing. Müller's other work from this period showed his deep concern for social justice issues and his commitment to documenting the experiences of society's most vulnerable members. His decision to photograph Mary, despite the fact that the image would not be used for any immediate commercial or advocacy purpose, suggested that he had recognized the historical importance of preserving evidence of child abandonment practices. The technical quality of the photograph and the careful attention to composition indicated that Müller had taken considerable care in creating the image, suggesting that he understood its potential significance as a historical document. The fact that Müller had kept the photograph in his personal collection rather than using it for publication also indicated a sensitivity to the privacy and dignity of his subject. Rather than exploiting Mary's situation for public attention or social reform messaging, he had preserved her image as a private memorial to her experience and that of thousands of other children who had faced similar circumstances. Dr. Kowalski's investigation ultimately led her to expand her research beyond Mary's individual story to examine the broader social and economic factors that had created the conditions leading to widespread child abandonment during the early 20th century. What she discovered was a perfect storm of circumstances that had made abandonment seem like a reasonable option for thousands of desperate families. The massive immigration and urbanization of the period had disrupted traditional family and community support systems, leaving many families isolated and without resources during times of crisis. Economic instability, including frequent depressions and job losses, had made it difficult for working-class families to maintain stable housing and adequate nutrition for their children. At the same time, social stigma surrounding poverty, illegitimacy, and various forms of family dysfunction had made it difficult for struggling families to seek help from existing charitable organizations. Many families preferred to abandon children rather than face the shame and social consequences of admitting their inability to provide adequate care. The institutional systems designed to help abandoned children were themselves part of the problem, as they were based on philosophies that emphasized removal of children from unfit families, rather than providing support that might have allowed families to stay together. The emphasis on placement in rural areas was motivated partly by genuine beliefs about the benefits of country living, but also by economic considerations that made it cheaper to ship children out of cities than to provide adequate urban facilities for their care. The child welfare professionals of the time operated under the assumption that poverty was primarily the result of moral failings rather than structural economic problems, leading them to focus on removing children from poor families rather than addressing the underlying causes of family poverty and instability. Dr. Kowalski's research revealed that the child abandonment crisis of the early 20th century had been largely forgotten by later generations, who preferred to focus on more uplifting stories of American progress and opportunity during this period. The experiences of children like Mary had been systematically excluded from historical narratives that emphasized immigration success stories and economic growth rather than the human costs of rapid social change. This historical amnesia had prevented society from learning important lessons about the factors that led to family breakdown and child endangerment, contributing to the repetition of similar patterns during later periods of economic and social stress. The parallels between the early 20th century child abandonment crisis and contemporary issues surrounding family homelessness, child welfare, and economic inequality were striking and sobering. Dr. Kowalski's work represented an attempt to recover these lost stories and to ensure that the experiences of abandoned children would be acknowledged and remembered. Her research methodology combined traditional historical techniques with modern technology, using digital databases, enhanced photographic analysis, and interdisciplinary approaches to piece together stories that had been scattered across multiple archives and institutions. The publication of Dr. Kowalski's research, including the story behind Muller's photograph of Mary, attracted significant public attention and media coverage. Many readers were shocked to learn about the extent of child abandonment during a period they had associated with family stability and traditional values. The image of Mary sitting alone on the park bench became a powerful symbol of the hidden costs of American industrialization and urbanization. The research also prompted renewed interest in the experiences of adopted and fostered children during the early 20th century, leading to the establishment of support groups and resources for individuals seeking information about family members who had been placed through the child welfare systems of that era. Several people came forward with family stories that paralleled Mary's experience, contributing additional evidence about the widespread nature of child abandonment during this period. Perhaps most importantly, Dr. Kowalski's work helped to contextualize contemporary debates about child welfare policy by demonstrating how economic inequality, social stigma, and inadequate support systems had created similar problems in the past. Her research provided historical perspective on ongoing issues related to family preservation, child protective services, and the long-term consequences of separating children from their biological families. The parallels between Mary's experience and that of contemporary children in foster care were particularly striking, highlighting how many of the same systemic problems that had existed in 1910 continued to affect vulnerable children more than a century later. The story of Mary Unknown also highlighted the importance of photographic evidence in preserving historical memory and ensuring that the experiences of society's most vulnerable members are not forgotten. Without Muller's decision to photograph the abandoned child in Lincoln Park, Mary's story would have been lost entirely, along with the stories of thousands of other children who experienced similar fates. The photograph that had once been filed away as a simple example of early 20th century children's portraiture had been revealed as a crucial historical document that preserved evidence of one of the most significant social crises of its era. Mary's forced smile, captured forever in silver and light, had become a testament to the resilience of children facing impossible circumstances and a reminder of society's responsibility to protect its most vulnerable members. Dr. Kowalski's research continued to expand as more families came forward with information about relatives who had been abandoned or placed for adoption during the early 20th century. Each new story added additional details to the emerging picture of how widespread child abandonment had been during this period and how inadequately society had responded to the crisis. The accumulation of evidence revealed that Mary's experience had been repeated thousands of times across the United States, with each instance representing not just an individual tragedy, but a systematic failure of social institutions to provide adequate support for struggling families. The children who had been abandoned during this period had borne the costs of adult decisions and social policies that had prioritized economic efficiency over human welfare. Many of these children had gone on to live successful lives despite their traumatic beginnings, demonstrating remarkable resilience and adaptability in the face of circumstances that would have broken many adults. However, the psychological and emotional costs of abandonment had often persisted throughout their lives, affecting their ability to form trusting relationships and to feel secure in their place in the world. The discovery that child abandonment had been so widespread during a period often romanticized as a golden age of family values prompted important conversations about how societies remember and forget their own histories. Dr. Kowalski's work demonstrated how selective historical memory could obscure important truths about the past and prevent societies from learning from their mistakes. One of the most significant outcomes of Dr. Kowalski's research was the establishment of the Mary Unknown Memorial Project, a collaborative effort between historians, social workers, and genealogists to identify and memorialize children who had died in institutional care during the early 20th century. The project worked to locate the unmarked graves of children like Mary and to provide them with proper headstones bearing their names and acknowledgement of their humanity. The Memorial Project also created an online database where descendants of abandoned children could search for information about their ancestors and connect with others who shared similar family histories. This resource proved invaluable for people who had grown up knowing only fragments of their family stories and who had long wondered about relatives who had simply disappeared from family narratives. The photograph of Mary Unknown had served as a key to unlocking these forgotten histories, proving that sometimes the most important historical evidence exists not in official documents or public records, but in private collections and personal archives where individuals had preserved traces of experiences that society had preferred to forget. Mary's story became a symbol of the thousands of children whose experiences had been overlooked by official histories focused on the achievements of prominent individuals and the growth of major institutions. Her forced smile in the face of abandonment represented the courage and dignity that ordinary people had shown during some of the most difficult periods in American history. The Chicago Historical Society created a permanent exhibition featuring Mary's photograph and the stories of other abandoned children from the same era, providing visitors with an opportunity to learn about this forgotten chapter of American history. The exhibition included interactive elements that allowed visitors to explore the social and economic conditions that had led to widespread child abandonment, as well as the long-term consequences of the policies and practices that had been used to address the crisis. Educational programs developed in conjunction with the exhibition reached thousands of students each year, teaching them about the importance of social safety nets and the responsibility of communities to care for their most vulnerable members. Many visitors reported that learning about Mary's story had changed their understanding of American history and had motivated them to become involved in contemporary child welfare causes. The lasting impact of Dr. Kowalski's research was to ensure that Mary Unknown and children like her would finally be recognized as important historical figures whose experiences deserved to be remembered and studied. The little girl who had been abandoned in Lincoln Park in 1910 had found her voice more than a century later through the dedication of researchers committed to recovering the lost stories of America's most vulnerable children. The photograph that had captured Mary at her moment of greatest vulnerability had ultimately served as the means of her historical redemption, transforming her from an anonymous victim into a powerful symbol of resilience and survival. Her smile, no longer forced but genuine in its historical significance, would continue to remind future generations of both the costs of social indifference and the importance of protecting children from the consequences of adult failures. In the archives of the Chicago Historical Society, Mary's photograph now occupies a place of honor, carefully preserved in climate-controlled storage and regularly displayed for researchers and visitors who come to learn about the hidden histories of American childhood. The technical information associated with the image has been updated to include not just the photographer's name and the date of creation, but also Mary's story and the broader historical context that gives the photograph its profound significance. Dr. Kowalski's work established new standards for historical research that emphasized the importance of looking beyond official narratives to recover the experiences of marginalized and forgotten populations. Her methodology has been adopted by researchers around the world who are working to uncover similar hidden histories in their own communities and nations. The Lonely Child of 1910 had finally found the recognition and understanding that had eluded her during her brief, difficult life. Mary Unknown's story served as both memorial and warning for generations yet to come, reminding us that behind every historical statistic are individual human beings whose lives matter and whose stories deserve to be told. Her forced smile, captured in that moment of abandonment over a century ago, had become a beacon of hope that even the most forgotten and marginalized voices could eventually be heard. Through the dedication of researchers like Dr. Kowalski and the power of preserved photographs like Jacob Muller's, the truth behind that smile had finally been revealed, ensuring that Mary's brief life would never again be forgotten by the society that had failed to protect her when she needed it most. In the end, Mary Unknown had achieved a form of immortality that transcended her tragic circumstances, her image serving as an eternal reminder of our collective responsibility to care for the children among us who have no one else to speak for them. The truth behind her smile had chilled the hearts of those who learned her story, but it had also inspired a new commitment to ensuring that no child would ever again have to face abandonment alone, forgotten by history and forsaken by the world.